Hello and welcome to our episode on hypoarousal. The other week we were talking about hyperarousal, and this week we're going to talk about what the opposite of that is. And we did touch on a bit on it last time, and then we're going to go into more depth of it this time.
Yeah, because I think if hyperarousal is the fight-flight response, then hypoarousal is the freeze, fawn, flop response.
Yeah.
And both of those are responses when we're in the outer limits of what we can deal with.
Mm-hmm. So it's essentially the body's gone into shutdown, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a response to overwhelm.
Mm-hmm.
And it's another protective mechanism because both hyperarousal and hypoarousal are there to keep us safe. They're protective mechanisms for when we are at risk or when there's a perceived potential risk. And that's our body and our brain doing everything it can to maintain our integrity and our safety and our well-being.
Yeah, as you're saying, just before we came on here, it was, as you said, body's protective measures. And as you said, it was preparing the body for any attack by a bear. So the body flops and it just anesthetizes itself to prepare for that assault.
Yeah, it's that almost that play dead response, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's if all else fails, if I'm not aware of it, if I can't hear it, I can't see it, I can't feel it, I can't experience it, then in a way I won't be aware of the harm.
Yeah,
So it's a
it'll all go
protective
away.
mechanism. And if I make it through to the other side and I have very little recall or memory of it, then in a way that also is a further safeguard to my own well-being.
Yeah.
I've gone through it without having to experience it.
Mm-hmm. So you're not getting those potential flashbacks, or you like in hyperarousal, where you might get the visual flashbacks. This is just completely numbing, not getting any visual or auditory sensations from it, really.
Potentially that's correct, but I think what we can't underestimate is how distressing that shutdown can be, because
Yeah.
while it's essential at the point of origination in terms of protecting us and keeping our integrity safe, if that continues beyond that point of origination
Mm-hmm.
and it starts to kind of bleed into our day-to-day lives when we least expect it, because maybe we are being triggered by something that our brain perceives as similar to, then that becomes something that's really difficult for us and can be really quite confusing for us to manage.
Yeah.
So is it worth talking about, because there's almost like a range within there, isn't there? I mean, when we're talking about things like the full-blown kind of dissociation, that's kind of like extreme end of that hypoarousal. But there are other things almost or levels before that. Is it worth us briefly talking about maybe some of the symptoms, the general symptoms of that hypoarousal state?
Yeah, definitely. The more information we give the listeners, then the more informed they can be.
Very true. So where I'm coming from in that is you might find that when you're starting to move into that hypoarousal state, you might experience emotional numbing, where it almost feels as though your emotions are on suppression, they're on lockdown. Nothing is very intense, or you might feel as though you're just not feeling any emotional response to things at all.
Yeah. And due to the lack of blood flow going to the frontal cortex of the brain, people may lose the ability to think and function that frontal cortex because they're just really that survival of the mammalian and reptilian brains. So basically, an limbic system of the more primitive areas of thinking. And so it's
Yeah,
more to do with survival than anything else.
yeah. It's almost, if you think of your responses as almost layers of interaction with your surroundings, there are key elements which are absolutely essential for survival. And those are the ones that we hope are going to sustain the longest. Everything else in that state will then be stripped away in preference for sustaining of that. So anything that is almost like a higher function at that point in time will be ditched in preference for the basics. So that means, for instance, things like decision making, you might find becomes much more difficult because your logical processing of information slows down. Your ability to take on complex concepts or think or problem solve becomes much slower, much more suppressed in the moment.
Yeah, and that will go along with that lack of thinking is if you're not digesting food properly, so you get slower digestion, that can lead to lower energy and then lowering up blood pressure as well. So you're not fully energized, feeling good about yourself.
Yeah, that means then that there's a knock-on impact of that. If everything's slowing down, then that means that can result in increased feelings of exhaustion. So you just are tired. There's almost like a sedative effect that your body and your brain is having on you.
Yeah.
And when the digestive system slows down, that means that all the nutrients, the vitamins that you actually need in terms of that are also impacted. So your ability to process that, to get that, becomes impacted. You might find, for instance, that your appetite is really suppressed as well. So that the urge to do these things is lessened as well. Your interactions with your everyday activity becomes much lessened.
Yeah, so physical lethargy, really, Ali, is what you're saying, I think.
Physical and mental lethargy.
Yeah.
And quite often people will have that that diagnosis of depression. I'm depressed. I'm feeling really down.
Yeah.
And when they say I'm feeling down, there's a literalness about that. They are feeling down. Everything is down. Everything is suppressed. That fits really, really well. Our emotions are down. Our responses are down. Our ability for decision making is down.
Yeah, well, if we were feeling up, then we wouldn't be feeling down, would we? It'd be the complete opposite. We'd be quite happy with ourselves. We'd be in a better place of thinking if we were feeling up. Would we not? Yeah. I know it's stating the bloody obvious, but
yeah, but you do have a talent for it.
I know, thanks, Ali. Yeah.
But I think sometimes I think we underestimate the impact that has on us.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I know at points where I have been under a huge amount of pressure in my life, where I've felt very overwhelmed, then even the simple tasks become incredibly difficult because the effort it takes to do that when all of your systems are down is tenfold. Even decisions about what you're going to have for dinner, are you going to eat that day, become really difficult for us to navigate because everything is so suppressed.
Absolutely. I got diagnosed with clinical depression a good few years ago now, and I was sent a form through. Mentally, it just seems so simple to fill it out. Just couldn't comprehend or work out how to do it, and it's just like it's just far too much.
Well, similarly, I remember going through a period in my life where there was a relocation, there was a house sale, there was a relationship breakup, and little things, little decisions, simple decisions that normally on a day-to-day basis I'd have done without even thinking about, within split seconds I'd have been capable of, became roadblocks that I couldn't get past.
Yeah.
Because I just didn't have the capacity at that point to process that on top of everything else and what I was feeling and experiencing at that point in time. I had just shut down.
Yeah. What took you, or how did you manage to get over that from being that state to more of a useful state for yourself?
Well, that's about chunking things down into smaller elements, so that if a task in itself is too big, then I would break it down into component parts until I found a part that was small enough for me to action.
Yeah.
That I could process, that I could make a decision about. And if I couldn't, then actually I would take that task, and I developed what I would refer to as my kitchen table method of dealing with things, because very literally I was doing almost like doing a house clearance, preparing a house for sale, etc. And as I was coming across things that I was having to make decisions about, whether you keep, whether you ditch, whether you recycle, whether you sell, whether you pass on to someone else or whatever, I would get roadblocked on it. I couldn't make a decision over what or where I did this or put this thing. So I would put it in the kitchen table. And the kitchen table became quite a metaphorical thing in terms of the things that were blocking me. Everything would go on the kitchen table. And that act of putting it to the side, whether that was an actual thing I had to make a decision about, or just almost like a process or an emotional decision, allowed me then to take a step back and move round it. And over a period of time, because I was still navigating and still aware of it, I found that it would find a solution for me almost in a way, because at that point of distraction, then I would look at the kitchen table and suddenly realize that I had a decision about something that I was finding it really difficult to make a choice over would suddenly be picked up and put in the bin. And it was easy because that point of distraction had allowed me to move beyond it and then see that no longer as a roadblock. So there was a repositioning of it. But it also took the pressure off in the moment.
Yeah.
So it didn't become something that stopped me in my tracks. It just became something that I detoured round.
Okay, that's a good solution. I like that.
I chunked down, split it into bits that were small enough for me to deal with. And if I came across something that would stop me in my tracks, then I put it to the side and took a detour.
Well, that sounds. So we were having a discussion previously about Overwhelm and go into Tesco's, were we not, or any major supermarket really, and the products that they have on the shelves, and somebody comes out of forces or has been in like an institution, they see all these products on the shelf and they go, wow, what's going on with all this? How do I cope with that? And get completely overwhelmed by that choice.
Rich, I feel
So we were
the way
playing a game of supermarket bingo.
We were, and I'm just opening up my supermarket shopping app right now. I feel as though we have a replay coming on here.
We do.
So what we were talking about was the fact that if you, and I think it's particularly relevant to things or any situation where you are part of an all-inclusive community, where your job is not just a job, but it's a way of life, where everything is provided for you, around you, and the structure is very clearly defined, and the military is a very good example of that. That means the actual number of choices that you probably make over the course of the day are very specific, but also quite limited.
Yeah.
And the number of things that you don't have to make choices about are probably quite extensive because they're provided for you.
Yeah, pretty much. So it'd be like 4 choices, 3 or 4 choices, maybe dinner time in the mess or wherever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you find yourself in a big supermarket with the instruction to pick up something for dinner. So how many choices in this large supermarket that I do online shopping occasionally with, and I'm not going to name one, but it's a very big one with the sort of blue and red logo. Yeah. How many choices do you think I've got coming up when I type in chicken?
I'm going with 150.
690. Right. What would you like with your chicken? Shall we go for chips?
I'll go for chips.
Right.
There's got to be at least 30.
105.
Right.
What about some frozen veg with that?
260.
Oh, I think it's glitched in this one. Because frozen vegetables is only come up with 5, and I know there's a lot more than that. Hang on a minute. Shall we be a bit more specific?
Go on in.
Frozen peas.
Frozen peas. What? 20.
Oh my God, 623. Mhm.
And the final one.
Ice cream? Do you want ice cream? Would you like dessert?
Yeah, but as well. I'm going for 800.
Oh, you're going to be sadly disappointed. 257.
Oh, I'm surprised at
That
that.
all. However, do you prefer tea or coffee?
We'd go for coffee.
Right, okay.
860.
221. How about a good brew?
Oh, 430.
133.
Is that all?
Uh-huh. Now, if I type in milk, however, in case you want milk in your tea or coffee, can go on, have a guess.
98.
Are you ready for this?
Go on in.
It's slightly higher than 98.
How much higher?
384.
384.
384.
Wow. You can see how people get overwhelmed by the amount of choice. And instead of just focusing on milk, for argument's sake, and going, right, full fat or semi-skimmed or whatever it is, they go, what we got, almond milk, rice milk, and God knows what, goat's
Oat
milk.
milk.
Yeah.
Lacto-free milk, although I'm not
Yeah.
sure that actually qualifies as milk, but yeah,
Yeah.
Long life milk, semi-skimmed, skimmed.
Yeah.
You can even get added protein milk.
Can you? All right. But you can see how this leads to overwhelm, people not being able to make those decisions when there's just, as you say, they've chunked up massively and I can't see the wood for the trees, as it were.
Yeah, and that's where the chunking down principle comes in. Because, for instance, when I go to the supermarket, much as though it's one of my most despised tasks of the week, but when I go to the supermarket, there are already filters in place for when I start that process. So when I look at, for instance, like milk products, I actually am not looking at those 384. I'm only looking at half a dozen because I'm one of those sad people that actually doesn't have dairy. I have oat milk as my preference, so I only look at the 6 oat milk options. The other 378 are not on my radar.
Yeah. But for other people, they will be.
They
Because
will
they haven't
be.
got those filters in place.
Yeah, they haven't got those filters in place. You know, so if I go shopping for chicken, I've already made a decision before I get there over whether I want fresh or frozen. So that started to narrow down my options. I've already made a decision over whether or not I'm going to be doing something that requires cooking from scratch or whether or not I want something that's just going to be a fly in the oven or the pan and let it do its stuff. So again, those are all starting to narrow down the field of options open to me. And that's one of the situations where actually adding more information in helps you narrow and simplify the choices.
Yeah, definitely. With that overwhelm and all that, so people get confused. That'll lead to memory loss because they're not able to think and they go, oh, I've got the list. Maybe they've got the list in their head. They go, I don't remember what I'm here to get. They go back home and a spouse will go, where's the chicken and where's the eggs and whatever, bread and whatever else it is? They go, what? You've got to get peaches or something that's completely different instead.
Yeah, or they might find that they actually get to the supermarket, you get within 3 feet of the front doors, and it's just too much.
Yeah,
it's just the total overwhelm. You find that it either spikes you into that hyperarousal state of anxiety, or it gets to the point of hypoarousal, which is what we're talking about today, where actually, as you say, the decision making slows down, becomes impossible, your brain shuts down and says, you know what, there's just too many options here, so let's just not. We're not going to do this today.
Yeah.
It actually physically prevents you.
Right. So that would lead to potential disassociation, wouldn't it? Where there's just too much information, not able to cope with it, and so you're mentally you're going, that's not my body now.
Well, in extreme situations,
Yeah.
it can very much, and dissociation is one of those extreme ends of that hypoarousal. But it's important to talk about because it can be very distressing. It can be very unsettling when you're experiencing it, because it can happen in a number of different ways. Now, we're not going to talk about, for instance, like fugue state dissociation, because that's a whole different thing. But we are potentially going to touch on things like depersonalization and derealization, which is what you were talking about there. And that's where it's almost kind of like we lose touch with ourselves. We lose touch with our sense of self. We don't recognize our own thinking, our own actions. It's almost like we're operating outside of ourselves. Like we are on the outside of a bubble, looking in, observing ourselves. And there's a distance between what we perceive ourselves as doing and our engagement with it. It's like there's the separation where we're almost acting separately from the person or version of ourselves that's actually doing the do.
Yeah, so it's a basically complete disconnect.
Yeah, and from a survival standpoint, as we mentioned at the very start, there's a very, very sound reason for dissociation to even exist in the first place, and that is that in extreme overwhelm and extreme stress, and if there's imminent harm, and generally when you go back to kind of like our raw evolutionary selves, and that would mean potential risk of significant injury, pain, or death, then at some point the brain goes, do you know what, it's probably better if you're not present for this.
Yeah.
And it kicks you out of the picture for a while.
Right. So the body's just been completely anaesthetized, really, hasn't it? To be prepared for possibly imminent death.
Yeah. And that can extend to the point where it can literally plunge us into almost that full shutdown, where we don't see our surroundings, we don't hear our surroundings, we don't feel our surroundings. We might be physically present and we might have our eyes open, be breathing or whatever, but our awareness of that is non-existent because we're entirely internalized into that internal, very limited sensory place because everything is in lockdown.
Yeah.
In extreme cases, it literally can be almost a blackout.
Yeah. How long do these disassociations go on for? I imagine years and years, can't they? Because until somebody goes and seeks help some sort of way, then it's very hard to get back into that, or it could be hard to get back into themselves, into that body.
They do. I think it's one of those things that I would always recommend that you talk to somebody about. You make them aware that you're experiencing this, because this is something that needs support. You need support and assistance with in addressing that. That dissociation, it's very common, for instance, where you have maybe prolonged exposure to things like gaslighting. You see it a lot in things like cult behaviours. You see it a lot in extreme trauma, where maybe the situation has been really overwhelming. There's been extreme violence, pain, dissociation, that sort of piece. All of those make sense in terms of that response. In terms of things like the gaslighting, the maybe where you've got coercive control, or where you have things like that cult type experience, that's there because it's almost as if you've literally gone through an experience where people have repeatedly told you that what you think is wrong, that what you're experiencing is wrong, that what you are believing is wrong, that what your lived experience in that moment is wrong. And as a result, it's almost pushed that wedge between you and your experience, and that wedge has got wider and wider and wider until the point where you no longer recognize that it's that's part of you. And
what goes along with that gaslighting is the love bombing as well. So people get that high of feeling really wanted, feeling needed, then they get that low of being told they're completely worthless or disregarded in some way. And then
Well,
they get bombed again. So they get that cycle of the up and down, and then don't know where to stand.
there can be in
Yeah.
terms of that, and I'm just wondering if that's almost like a whole different episode that we do in terms of that cycle, because that's quite a complex linkage there, and there's a huge amount that goes on in terms of the impact on the individual. There's a whole element in terms of trauma bonding within there as well, because that triggers a whole host of physiological responses that become habitual, cyclical, and to a certain extent almost addictive in their hit, and one of those being that dopamine hit within that. But in terms of that disassociation, again, that's a protective mechanism there. It's almost as if our brains have put a protective perimeter around our sense of self to keep us separate from what's happening.
Yeah.
But in doing so, it's almost like we've lost contact with ourselves. We are still there. It's just that because we don't recognize the two halves as being the same part of that person, because we're not as intricately attached to all of that or intertwined, then it can feel very abnormal, like we're observing somebody else's life or somebody else's experience.
And that can also be linked to feelings of things like shame as well, because depending on the job role, what somebody may be doing, they may feel that they should have actually done something about that situation. Maybe some guy who's 6'4", good 18 stone, and he gets attacked or assaulted and beaten up by somebody who's 4'5", and they may feel shame and guilt about all that, and then disassociate in that way as well.
Yeah, and it's quite often that point of disassociation or dissociation will be linked to, and that comes down to that kind of initiating moment. And it can either be a one-off event that's pushed you into that response, that defense response, because it is a defense response. Or it can be a sequence of events that have gradually, as I said, created that wedge that's got wider and wider and wider until the point where you don't recognize. So either of those are both viable options. In terms of that almost the initial instigating event where it's a one-off, then that's literally where your brain has probably at some point taken the decision that it's best that you play dead. That's where you're straight into the flop almost response, where it's been in your best interest not to remember, recall, experience, visualize, feel any of what's going around about you. So let you down.
And the other side of things, that it could be that somebody's started breaching somebody else's boundaries very slowly, and then start increasing that boundary breach, and then make it more and more of a breach, like as you said, like that big wedge, where it just gets, you're so used to that situation, you think it's quote unquote normal, and it clearly isn't.
That comes down to the I think you and I have had these conversations before, Rich. It's where we have an experience that becomes so prevalent within our life that over a period of time we cease to recognize that it isn't standard. We start to then process that as part of our normal, so that it's almost like we become nose blind to our emotional state. And in doing so, we stop recognizing what we're actually emotionally experiencing or not experiencing.
Would you mind explaining nose blind to people if they've never heard that term before?
So nose blind is that simple, lovely fact that your nose only smells or recognizes or flags new smells. And that's because if it flagged and processed and made you aware of every single scent that you came across every second of every day, you would be in sensory overwhelm with the sheer volume of them. That's why over a period of time, we don't smell our favorite scents if we wear them a lot, whether that's aftershave or perfume or body moisturizers or whatever, your favorite soap. We become blind to that scent because it becomes part of our normal template that needs no notice or obvious processing. So we become nose blind. To put it bluntly, that's why when somebody farts, we always notice, because that's unusual. It's introduced into the surroundings, and we're immediately aware that that's different.
Oh yeah, depends if it's silent. Well, yeah.
But even then, because it's immediately out of pattern. So if you think about it, if we apply that concept of nose blind to other senses, it applies equally to that as well.
Yeah.
And one of those is our emotional engagement. We become emotionally blind to our own emotional state because we now no longer see that as different from, but part of our normal pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could end up with maladaptive or coping strategies. And these can range from a whole host of things like self-harming, which is maybe to make somebody feel alive and get back into their body from that disassociation.
Well, if we're aware that there is a range, and quite often what goes with that dissociation of what can be so distressing is the awareness that we are not experiencing the wealth of emotions that we should, that we are aware of the dampening of our experience,
Numbness.
the numbness of it, and we're recognizing that this isn't something that is normal. And while that can apply to all of our emotions, because if we're applying a filter, unfortunately,
limiting our range of, as you say, limit our range of emotions. So you might just have a word for happy, sad, angry, and something else I can't think what it's top of my head. Instead of saying happy could be joyful, you could be feeling loved. Sadness, or angry could be raging, could be whatever else. You just express more and more about what that emotion is.
Emotions come in a range, and they come in a range of intensity as well. But when we are experiencing the numbing, when we are experiencing that hypoarousal, that numbing is applied as a universal dampening. It's not selective. It doesn't apply to one emotion and not another. It's a blanket term that goes over the lot.
Yeah.
And that means then that all of our emotional repertoire and the array is dampened and downed and subdued. And that's the situation when it's very intense, when the numbing is really intense. Then that can be when we're aware of that, it can be distressing. For instance, that might be, for instance, where you're experiencing a point where you know you should feel sad, yet you can't express those emotions. You are numb to it. Where you know that you should be feeling really happy because this is something to celebrate that you're experiencing, yet you are numb to it.
Yeah.
And in those situations, then sometimes, yes, people revert to that self-harming because that's a means of feeling something when there's a total absence of anything.
Yeah. And I think as well, when in that state of numbness, people aren't expressing any emotion, other people may see that as them being apathetic or not caring as well. So people can get, if they don't know someone's personal circumstances, they can then get that wrong message about who that person is and what they're about.
Well, the other thing, which is sometimes also a big risk, is that they might actually underestimate the impact that's having and perceive you as being okay when you are very far from okay.
Yeah.
Because you are not experiencing or demonstrating these strong waves of emotion, they will assume that you are okay. And what they then may not recognize is that you're actually operating from that state of suppression. That you can appear to be very calm, very controlled, and very, very moderated, but actually that's the issue.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Well, the classic examples are when somebody greets somebody and says, "Hey, how you doing?" And somebody will go, "Yeah, all right."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they don't want to hear the whole conversation of, "I ain't feeling too good today." Yeah, it's just a very um, thin veneer of what we're looking at,
Mm-hmm.
and not going into deeper as to who that person really is and what's wrong with them, if there is anything at all.
Well, the other thing sometimes, Rich, is that we actually stop recognizing it in ourselves as well, and
Yeah.
that's also the risk.
Mm-hmm.
So that I remember a period in my life where I was very sad for a very long period of time, but it became to the point where I no longer recognized that I was sad.
Yeah.
I
So,
actually had no comprehension that this was what I was. And people, and I remember on a rare occasion where somebody would make a comment, and I would be in total denial about it because it didn't make sense to me. It's like, how can you possibly think that's the case? Because I had no longer any capacity to recognize that, because it was so deeply imprinted into my pattern of normal that I didn't have the capacity to acknowledge that that was
yeah.
there.
So that became your normal.
It was my normal.
Yeah.
That to me was not something of note or something of worth or something that was even out of place. And therefore, when somebody suggested that it was, I didn't recognize it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that in a way meant that, and that's quite common with that dissociation, with that numbing, with that hypoarousal, is when it's sustained for a period of time, then it gets to the point where you can be at the point where you don't even recognize that in yourself because it's so deeply entrenched. It's almost like you've forgotten what anything else is.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is just it.
Yeah.
And that's where the feedback of others can sometimes feel even alienating also.
Yeah, because people don't want to hear the truth, or a perceived truth.
Well, I think sometimes also the other element is that in those situations we've maybe lost the capacity at that point in time to see anything else.
Yeah.
And it takes something quite startling to push us into a point where we are able to reassess and go, do you know what? Actually, this is an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sometimes it's when we stop feeling that way that we recognize that this has been very wrong for a very long period of time.
Yeah. Stuck in a proverbial pit without any escape route that they can see, or no light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, but you don't actually realize you're in a pit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of that numbness, in terms of that hypoarousal, I suppose it comes back to that concept of, and we've used it repeatedly, is every response has a positive intention behind it. It's just that sometimes they come out of place. They are sustained beyond the point where they are useful to us and start to become something that is a habitual response to things that becomes quite a significantly limiting factor in our experiences of life.
Yeah. So we take on, as mentioned before, is maladaptive behaviours to potentially feel something. Or the other extreme end of things is isolating yourself from having to deal with people, having to cope with other people's foibles, I suppose, whether they're good or positive or how they come across to be.
Well, if you're also in that point of denial where you no longer recognize the level of dissociation you have from your own emotions, the level of shutdown that you're experiencing, and people insist on pointing that out to you.
Yeah. You don't want to hear it.
You don't want to hear it. No, you're not in a place where you can process that or believe it. You're in total denial of that. So therefore you will avoid that conversation. And the final irony is that our brains will look for congruence in things. It likes patterns. Our brain's like a giant matchy machine.
Yeah, well, we mentioned that on the other podcast. On last week was the reticular activating system. So whatever we decide to focus on, we're going to notice that a lot more than other things. So if you buy yourself a brand new BMW, you could notice a lot more BMWs, for argument's sake.
Yeah. And the other part of that matchy machine is that if we are feeling down and depressed, if we are feeling lonely, then our brain will seek to replicate that for us, because that thinks that it's what we're looking for. So it will start to suggest that we isolate further. We will withdraw from people around about us. We will withdraw from social interaction, because in doing so, our actions then match our emotional response.
Which could then lead to something like claustrophobia. You're not wanting to leave the house or wherever you're living.
Well, or agoraphobia, where you literally become locked into a very small circumstance. It can do. It can lead to that social anxiety. It can lead to being anxious about out in those social settings, because we've withdrawn so much that becomes part of our pattern. You look at COVID. COVID was a classic example where we were all in such a prolonged state of isolation for so long that actually the thought of social interaction for a lot of us became really quite stressful. You know, not only was there the inherent risks associated with that we were told about repeatedly, but there was also the fact that fundamentally we were all out of practice.
Yeah.
Because social interaction is a practiced skill. And if we don't do that for a while and we don't socialize, we become a bit rusty in those skills. And that's something that then has to be built up in terms of our comfort, familiarity with again.
Very much so.
So we've covered quite a lot there.
I think so, Ali, yeah.
So we've covered off the kind of the basics of that hypoarousal, that numbness, the potential for dissociation, the depressive response that it has, the fact that it's there to protect us, to safeguard our thinking, and in a way to make sure that if there's something particularly traumatic or difficult for us, that we don't actually have to experience it. We can literally block and sift it out. But then we've also covered off
overwhelm and how to chunk down. Well, not necessarily how to chunk down, but look at the smaller picture and make that smaller picture more accessible and easier to utilize for yourself.
Yeah, that sometimes
put those things on your kitchen table.
Well, sometimes in a situation where we're overwhelmed with choices, actually more information is the route through, because the more information helps us limit the choices we then have to make.
Yeah.
And that kitchen table, find a way. If you're being blocked in terms of making a decision, then put it to the side and detour around it. Chunk it down into smaller component parts so you find a part you can make a decision about.
And focus on what you're wanting, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of closing out for this week, I suppose what I wanted to say to him is, if any of what we've talked about today is sounding vaguely familiar, is something that you are aware resonates with you, then please do speak to somebody about it. Have a conversation with your GP about it. Have a conversation with other people that may have experienced similar. Make people aware that this is what you're experiencing. Seek help, because this is something that can change for you. It's not something you have to live with infinitely.
You're not alone. There's plenty of people out there who've gone through similar things. Maybe not experienced exactly the same things as you, but they most likely have gone through that.
It's important to remember that what enriches life is the array of our emotions. That's the colours that enrich it. They're there for a reason.
Yeah, look at the colour wheel or that emotion chart. Yeah.
Yes. So in terms of how people can access this, we're available on a range of podcast platforms. So hopefully you're listening to us on one of them just now. But if you wish to contact us, you can either through the email address that's associated with the podcast, and you'll find the show notes, or through any of our social media platforms. So at the moment, that's Facebook and LinkedIn, and soon to be a website as well too.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Rich, and we'll be back next week.
Yeah, awesome. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.